the theme of the Molienda this year is the olive tree as a symbol of hope, survival, and regeneration. And who better to talk about certainly the healthy nature of olive oil than our guest speaker. We're very proud and privileged to have Simon for a second time at the Molienda in English. Simon is the author of the olive oil diet and an expert on the Mediterranean diet. And Simon, I'd like you to introduce yourself a bit more fully, and thank you very much. And I hope you all enjoy the talk, and any feedback on chat would be very welcome. Okay, Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Leila. Thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, and it's a great privilege and pleasure to be here today. So for those who don't know me, my background is that I'm a practicing physician, a doctor here in Cambridge in the UK, on the front line, particularly in the last year during the pandemic. But prior to that, I was a great advocate of the Mediterranean diet for my patients. I came across the benefits of the Mediterranean diet, I suppose, 15, 20 years ago, as the evidence began to amass for its benefits, and started to communicate that to my patients. And they wanted to hear more about it. And so I began to speak in public and began to introduce people to some of the ideas and the concepts behind the Mediterranean diet. And I've seen real changes in my patients in terms of how healthy they are, in terms of their blood pressure, their weight, how fit they feel. And so now I have the privilege of traveling and going to places to talk a little bit more about the Mediterranean diet. And it's a great privilege to be here in Cambridge, but virtually in Rio Gordo. And I know that there are many people from Europe and some people from the States here joining us today. And if you do get an opportunity, when we are all back to traveling, to visit Rio Gordo, please do so. I had the pleasure of attending this festival and doing a talk 2 years ago. And it was an absolute delight to see this beautiful, amazing small town just north of Malaga. So the bustle and the busyness of the costa, but actually 20, 30 minutes up into the hills, you get this wonderful, beautiful, peaceful, quiet, whitewashed Andalusian village, which is based around the culture largely of the olive tree, with its own olive press. And this is a great festival, I think, to come and talk about olive oil and how we can spread that and advocate the wonders of the Mediterranean diet and the olive tree beyond those shores. So I'd like to thank Leila and the mayor for inviting me then and for inviting me back again to talk. And today's talk is going to be a theme of the olive oil and the olive tree as a symbol of hope and of regeneration. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current situation, the context of the pandemic, and then move on to the Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil and its role in health. So my objectives in the next sort of 20 to 30 minutes is to try to help people to understand a little bit about some of the scientific basis for the Mediterranean diet. I'm aware that there's a mixed audience here today, that we have respected and eminent a professor from Yale, who's probably going to kill me when he realizes that, having got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, this is actually recorded and he might be able to see it later. But thanks for joining it as Tassos. And I'm not sure whether Francisco Tapia, a local doctor in Malaga, is joining us, but he's also a great expert on the Mediterranean diet. So there will be people who clearly know a great deal about olive oil and the Mediterranean diet, but I'm going to talk really about some of the basic principles which I think we can communicate to people to help them understand a little bit more about the Mediterranean diet. And finally, when we end this talk, I hope that we will be in a position of some hope. It's been a terrible year. I've spent the last several weeks vaccinating on the front line, running some vaccination centers, and that is giving me hope that we will get back to some kind of normality. But I think there are some lessons to be learned over the last year, and the opportunity to reset ourselves a little bit in terms of health. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the olive tree just as a symbol. Clearly, it's a symbol of this festival. There are many fiestas and festivals that go on in Spain and in other parts of the Mediterranean, celebrating the olive tree and the pressing of the olive oil. And indeed, UNESCO describes the Mediterranean diet as an intangible cultural heritage, which includes aspects like these kind of festivals celebrating the olive tree and the pressing of olive oil. When I gave the talk a couple of years ago, I think it was the first time that there had been some connection in the English language of this festival. And we had many expats from Northern Europe, from Britain, who actually attended the event to hear something about olive oil, and they went on a trip to the press, a trip to see how it's produced. And I think that's really important for people who are living in these areas who perhaps have come from abroad to understand the importance of olive oil and the importance of diet for locals. And I think it helps people to integrate into that local culture and gain some greater understanding. So a couple of years ago, when we had, I think it was about 100, 150 people attending the Molienda for the first time to hear something about the festival in English, it was astonishing to see people try to understand and really connecting with that local experience and with the importance of the olive tree and olive oil in the culture. And the olive tree has been a symbol in history over millennia. It's a symbol of peace, a symbol of regeneration. We have very, very ancient trees going back 2,000 or 3,000 years, and it's been well known by mankind to be a survivor, and to help and support mankind in diet and in achieving the Mediterranean diet and health. And I think there's an old Greek proverb which says that the measure of a culture of society is if it plants trees under which those people who plant the trees know they will never experience the shade of those trees. And I think that's a wonderful wonderful metaphor for the fact that the tree goes on for years, decades, even millennia beyond those who plant it. And if you go to Rio Gordo today, you will see new olive trees being planted for future generations, because of course they take 20 or 30 years to reach some sort of maturity. And the olive tree over history has had this association with regeneration. The olive tree is remarkable about its ability to survive. And I think that's particularly helpful for us to think about that in the context of the pandemic. So Herodotus described in Greece, in ancient Greece, the fact that the olive tree on the Acropolis, which was burnt when the Persians invaded in 480 BC and took over the Acropolis, and it was burnt and apparently destroyed. But then when Themistocles, the Battle of Salamis, regained Athens and the people went back to the Acropolis, that ancient tree soon began to sprout new, fresh, healthy shoots despite the fire and the destruction. And that was a symbol to the people of Athens about the hope, about regeneration, about the longevity and the survival of that olive tree, which was supposed to have been the original olive tree that Athena had gifted to the city in exchange for faithfulness to the goddess Athena. And there are stories like that through history. And of course, we know that the olive tree and olive oil has forged empires over the last several thousand years and been a cornerstone of cultures that have come and that have gone. We know that olive trees and olive oil has survived plagues of the Middle Ages. And indeed, there is a tree near to Rio Gordo, which is 1,000 years old, which would have been through human plagues over the Middle Ages. Of course, the olive tree is a symbol of survival through wars. And of course, the last pandemic, the flu pandemic in the early 20th century, which of course is unfair to call the Spanish flu. It's got the name the Spanish flu, but actually the reason why it was called Spanish flu was not because it was any higher in numbers in Spain, but it was that Spain was one of the few neutral countries towards the end of the First World War who had an uncensored press and media. So they were reporting the fact that even King Alfonso suffered from that flu, and so it gained the name rather unfairly of Spanish flu, but in fact actually it affected the States very greatly. But the olive tree has survived through that pandemic and will indeed survive as we will through this pandemic. And of course, the symbol, the ultimate symbol of hope was in the Bible, where Noah, of course, received the news of the regeneration, the rebirth of the earth through the dove carrying the olive tree. So we have that symbol over time of olive tree in terms of regeneration, in terms of hope, in terms of survival, in terms of longevity. And so moving on to the pandemic, because I think all conversations these days at the moment really have to be taken into account in the context of this pandemic. I think the pandemic does provide us with some opportunities to reset some of our belief systems, some of the way that we view the world. And I'd like to talk a little bit about community and sustainability, and then move on to health. And then we can talk a little bit about the Mediterranean diet and olive oil in particular, in terms of the benefits for health in the context, again, of the pandemic. And so in terms of community, I think there are lessons to be learned from the pandemic about how communities can come together. We've been in lockdown for much of the time, much of Europe, and certainly I, in my own community, have seen communities coming together, supporting each other, those of our populations who've been most at risk, have been shielded to a large extent by help and support through communities. And the Mediterranean diet is based around communities. As I said earlier, the UNESCO definition of the Mediterranean diet includes this reference to the importance of community. And though we have not been able to make contact with each other and be as physical and hugging each other as much as we have previously, it's been really clear to me in the UK, when I've seen my communities, my patients, brought together by the pandemic, how important this idea of local community is for people to flourish. Sustainability, I think, is another issue that we need to rethink in terms of the pandemic. Of course, we've had issues, the climate crisis, car crash, which preceded the pandemic, which of course is still a major threat to humankind, probably greater than the pandemic in the longer run. But it's an opportunity to think about how we live our lives in terms of climate change, and in terms of whether the pandemic can teach us any lessons about living a more sustainable life. And the Mediterranean diet is an incredibly sustainable form of eating. We know that there was a study in Spain, for example, which showed that if a much more Mediterranean diet was adhered to, there was likely to be a 70% reduction in the production of greenhouse gases, a 52% reduction in energy use, and a 33% reduction in water usage. We know that 1 litre of extra virgin olive oil sinks 10 kilos of carbon dioxide, and that 10 tons of carbon dioxide are sunk per hectare of olive tree cultivation in a well-managed grove. So we can see that there are opportunities to reset our diets and to make it much more sustainable in terms of climate change. There are also financial gains, and we know that the pandemic will create financial stress in many parts of the world. And there have been some modeling studies which have been done in the States, for example, which shows that if we adopted 20% more of a Mediterranean-style diet, $30 billion in healthcare costs would be saved per year. And if that Mediterranean diet adoption was done to a degree 80% closer to a Mediterranean diet, that could be, those savings could be as much as $88 billion in healthcare costs per year in the USA alone. So again, perhaps this is an opportunity just to think about health and well-being in the context of the pandemic. What we've seen as physicians on the front line of the pandemic as well is that COVID particularly hits people who are vulnerable, who have pre-existing diseases. So this makes the Mediterranean diet and the health of extra virgin olive oil even more important to communicate, because we know that people with high blood pressure, people with existing heart disease, people with obesity, with diabetes, and with conditions which are related to inflammation are much more likely to have severe COVID. These are patients who are much more likely, sadly, to end up on intensive care units and potentially die from the disease. And we can take each of these pre-existing conditions and show that a Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil can actually prevent many of those conditions. Now, clearly, it would be wrong to suggest that there is a one dietary pattern or there is one food that can prevent people from getting COVID, or indeed that can successfully treat people when they have COVID. We've got to be cautious about how we present this. There is no panacea at this point in time. But if we can help people to understand how they can adopt a diet which reduces the risks of those pre-existing conditions, then moving forwards, people will gain in terms of those health. And we know that, for example, early diabetes can be reversed within a matter of months. So I've been advocating to patients here that if they adopt a more Mediterranean, healthy style of diet, then it is a matter of weeks or months before they gain the benefits. But in the context of a pandemic that will probably continue to rumble on despite vaccinations, it's really important to get that message along. And so we can take each of these pre-existing conditions in turn, and we can look at how they're helped by the Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil. So blood pressure is a risk factor for severe COVID. There was a recent study coming out of Australia, which added to many studies which have shown that blood pressure can be reduced through adopting a Mediterranean-style diet. Extra virgin olive oil, it's thought that the fats combined with the nitrates in plant compounds, again, to form compounds which help and support reductions in blood pressure. Heart disease, cardiovascular disease, again, another risk factor for severe COVID. And there is plenty of compelling evidence that the Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil reduce the risk of heart disease. We can talk about the Leon Heart study. We can talk about the long-term EPIC and SUN studies that are going on, which are showing this reduction in heart disease. And the Predimed study, which was based in Spain, also showed a 30% reduction in the rate of ischemic heart disease for people who were adopting a Mediterranean-style diet. And extra virgin olive oil itself also has been shown to reduce, for example, the inflammation of the cholesterol plaques in blood vessel walls. So the antioxidants in extra virgin olive oil are likely to reduce the risk of heart disease itself. Obesity, a big risk factor for severe COVID. Mediterranean diet has been shown to promote long-term healthy weight management. And this is in comparison with other diets. So a big study by Shah in Israel showed that in comparison with low carbohydrate diets, Atkins style diets, and low fat diets, the Mediterranean diet achieved a longer, more sustained reduction in weight over as much as 6 years. And of course, it's a much more sustainable diet in itself, because patients are much more likely to continue on that diet because it is so much more enjoyable, as well as being healthy and beneficial in terms of weight. Despite being a relatively high fat diet, extra virgin olive oil again has been shown to not be associated with increasing weight. And in fact, fat deposition following a meal with extra virgin olive oil has been shown to be much more healthily distributed rather than with saturated fats. Diabetes, again, a significant risk factor for severe COVID. Mediterranean diet, the Predimed study showed that there was a reduction in the incidence of diabetes by as much as 50%. Other studies in younger individuals who are at less of a risk has been shown that you can perhaps reduce the risk by as much as 80%. There was a study from the States on college students showing significantly reduced rates of developing type 2 diabetes with the Mediterranean diet. Extra virgin olive oil itself probably plays a role. It increases insulin sensitivity. Insulin is the hormone that diabetics lack in terms of its efficiency, its efficient working. And extra virgin olive oil can be said to increase the sensitivity of insulin. And again, extra virgin olive oil combined with carbohydrates reduces the sugar rise of a meal. So if you have pasta with extra virgin olive oil, you'll find that there's a reduction in the rise in glucose, which all goes to contribute towards the reduced risk of insulin resistance and then eventually diabetes. Again, the diet can reduce inflammation, and chronic inflammatory conditions probably make COVID a worse disease. And the Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil is full of anti-inflammatory compounds, which we will explore a little bit more later on in the talk. So it's important to explain to people how diet relates to severe COVID in terms of preventing those long-term conditions that are associated with the most devastating cases of the disease. There's also some interesting conversations, I think, to be had about whether or not COVID itself, in terms of the progression of the illness, is dependent on diet, and whether if you have a good diet as you head into getting the illness, whether or not that protects. And there's some interesting research recently released only this week about the importance of a compound called platelet aggregation factor. One of the things we see in patients with severe COVID is the tendency to clot. And there are many elements in the Mediterranean diet, and including extra virgin olive oil, which reduce the activity of these clotting agents in the blood. So perhaps might reduce the risk of those blood clots associated with COVID. A lot of patients are seen to have low vitamin D levels. Now, it's not fully understood whether or not how important vitamin D is in terms of preventing the most severe cases of COVID. And as yet, the medical community is not entirely sure whether we should be recommending or advocating vitamin D in advance of getting the illness. But certainly the Mediterranean diet is a diet which, again, a study published actually only this week showing how it's a diet which is associated with a richness in vitamin D. And interestingly, extra virgin olive oil, despite containing no vitamin D, will increase the absorption of vitamin D because it's a fat-soluble vitamin. And so having a meal with extra virgin olive oil also is likely to enhance absorption of vitamin D, and so make us more resilient, perhaps, to the worst cases of the pandemic. So preventing those illnesses which are most associated with severe illness, and also having a diet, having a good diet, a good anti-inflammatory diet, a good vitamin D rich diet going into an illness is clearly something which is protective and something which we should be communicating. So how do we communicate the Mediterranean diet? I want to spend a few moments just talking about what the Mediterranean diet is. And as I said earlier on in the talk, I know that there are some experts on the line already, but we need to understand how we can communicate the benefits of the Mediterranean diet to the general public in relatively simplistic terms, because people are receiving lots of information from lots of different sources and can be really confused by that advice. And I think there is often an oversimplistic interpretation of the Mediterranean diet without much attention to some of the details of the diet, which I think are really important to gain the most health benefits. So we know the Mediterranean diet is associated with reduced risks of heart disease, of stroke, of diabetes, of obesity, of inflammatory conditions, including asthma, including arthritis, and also, most intriguingly, we've shown decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia based on the Mediterranean diet. So it really is a diet for all conditions. It's remarkable how it can have an influence on reducing the risk of so many chronic diseases. The foods can be described, I think, fairly straightforwardly to the public and to patients. There are pyramids, for example, which we can see. There are various versions of this which show how much food, various different quantities of different types of food people can be consuming to enjoy the healthiest type of Mediterranean diet. Sometimes I think these pyramids underplay the importance of extra virgin olive oil, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Some of these food pyramids, I think, have extra virgin olive oil sort of slightly hidden amongst other staples of the Mediterranean diet, but I think it really is increasingly seen to be a crucial part of that diet. So we can describe the foods in terms of plenty of vegetables, in terms of fruits, in terms of high herbs and spices, of plenty of fish, of extra virgin olive oil at its heart. We can describe it in terms of nuts and seeds, with certainly reduced ultra-processed and processed foods, with red meat consumed relatively rarely in comparison to our standard Western diet. It's even more interesting, I think, to try to explain how the diet works, because it's one thing to present a diet to people, but it's helpful if people understand precisely how it's thought now that it works. And we can get away from the what I call the macronutrient wars. At the moment, the media is full of low carbohydrate, keto, Atkins, low fat diets, low calorie diets, 5-2 diets. I think we have been rather obsessed with the macronutrients, which, although they compromise most of the volume of the foods, it's being increasingly shown that some of the micronutrients, some of the smaller volume constituents of a diet have actually significant effects on the healthy overall effects of that diet, and they punch above their weight in terms of that effect. So we can talk about those macronutrients in the context of the Mediterranean diet. We can say that the fats are good fats, they're monounsaturated fats, which generally have a good effect on cholesterol and don't contribute so much to weight gain as saturated fats. We can talk about the fats in that context. We can talk about the carbohydrates. We can say that the Mediterranean diet is a low GI carbohydrate diet, and what that means is that it consists mainly of carbs, which are vegetables and whole grains, and whole fruits, which contain the sugars in the structures of complex carbohydrates, which are released much more slowly than the simple sugars that are in high GI foods. So the carbohydrates are low GI, healthy carbohydrates. And for those colleagues of mine who are promoting low carbohydrate diets, I always ask the question, well, are you contributing vegetables to those diets? Because vegetables are, of course, predominantly carbohydrates. What about fiber? Fiber is good for us. We absolutely have compelling evidence about the importance of fiber, and fiber is essentially carbohydrates. So if people are promoting a low carbohydrate diet, it's really important that actually they make a distinction and talk about low GI carbohydrates, those ones which release their sugars slowly, which are much less likely to be associated with weight gain and diabetes. Proteins. The proteins of the Mediterranean diet, again, are good and healthy proteins, because the proteins are often sourced from fish, which contain other compounds such as omega-3 fats, good healthy omega-3 polyunsaturates. The proteins are often sourced from legumes, from beans, from pulses, which again deliver fiber and other micronutrients, other B vitamins, for example, as opposed to the proteins of red meat, which are a much higher source of volume of protein in a standard Western diet. So we can talk about the macronutrients in the Mediterranean diet and demonstrate why they will confer a healthy pattern of eating. But it's also important to come down and talk about the vitamins, which are very rich in the Mediterranean diet, minerals, increasingly seeing the importance of minerals such as selenium and zinc in good health, and of course bioactive compounds like polyphenols. Polyphenols are becoming increasingly of interest to the scientific community, and although we don't hear very much about them in the media for the general population, we'll talk a little bit about polyphenols in a few minutes' time to see how important these plant compounds are for health. The Mediterranean diet also, as a dietary pattern, has positive effects on our genes. It can turn on and turn off good and bad genes. There's some intriguing and fascinating research showing how it supports a really healthy gut microbiome. So we should be thinking about what we're eating to maintain that healthy gut microbiome. And the Mediterranean diet possibly exerts some of its healthy influences through promoting a very positive gut microbiome. And again, something of interest is the fact that if you combine foods together, they have different effects. So not many people are discussing the combination of foods. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that can have a dramatic effect on the effect of the Mediterranean diet. And extra virgin olive oil is absolutely central to the Mediterranean diet. If you look around the Mediterranean, you'll see a mixed geography, you'll see mixed cultures, you'll see different amounts of different foods being consumed all around the Mediterranean diet. There is no one single model of the Mediterranean diet, but wherever you go, you will see vegetables and extra virgin olive oil. And indeed, when scientists measure the benefits of the Mediterranean diet, they measure it with Mediterranean diet scores, which rank vegetables very highly. And extra virgin olive oil has the regular consumption of extra virgin olive oil in considerable amounts counts for as many positive points as vegetables in this scoring system. So clearly it's key, clearly it's important, and there is now some evidence showing that as a single ingredient, it can have beneficial effects. And nutritional science is quite complicated, it's quite difficult, and so it's a great challenge to show that a single food can have benefits for health. But certainly extra virgin olive oil as a unique food has been shown to reduce, for example, to be associated with a reduced risk of stroke and heart disease. There was a study in Bordeaux which showed that the highest consumers of extra virgin olive oil were as much as 70% less likely to have a stroke than those who consumed none at all. We know the importance of extra virgin olive oil in terms of ischemic heart disease, in terms of cardiovascular disease, and the Predimed study, which was a Mediterranean diet supplemented by extra virgin olive oil, showed a significant reduction in heart disease. And interestingly, the Predimed study, measuring the compliance to the diet, the researchers measured a compound in the urine called hydroxytyrosol, which is unique to extra virgin olive oil and olives. So it was measuring the adherence, measuring the compliance to the diet by showing that there was derivatives of extra virgin olive oil in people's urine. So again, there's some interesting studies about whether or not extra virgin olive oil as a single ingredient, but part of the Mediterranean diet, can reduce the risk of cancers, can reduce the risk of excessive clotting, the effect of extra virgin olive oil on platelets, which are the cells which promote clotting. Some fascinating research ongoing. And recently, coming out of Greece, there was a study which showed that those people who were in a pre-dementia state of pre-Alzheimer's dementia, if they were shown to be having high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil, so that's the olive oil particularly rich in antioxidants, they were much less likely to go on and have deterioration in their cognitive, in their brain function when they were fed a considerable amount of this high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil. So extra virgin olive oil and the Mediterranean diet, there's increasing evidence, it's compelling, and we should be communicating, I think, this to the general public. So just to talk a little bit about extra virgin olive oil as that major staple, that major ingredient of the Mediterranean diet. Of course, most people see extra virgin olive oil and they're not quite sure what the difference is between extra virgin olive oil and plain olive oil. And it's important to help people to understand, as part of the education that we do, that the olive oil is a refined product using low quality oil sent off to the refinery processed with approximately 10 or 15% extra virgin olive oil added back to provide some taste, but which is really very low in these polyphenol antioxidant compounds. And these are probably key to the way in which extra virgin olive oil confers the health benefits as an antioxidant, as an anti-inflammatory. So extra virgin olive oil, as opposed to the refined product, is clearly where we're going to get the health benefits. Olive oil is a good fat, it's a monounsaturated fat, but it doesn't have these anti-inflammatory and antioxidant elements to it. These polyphenol compounds which confer this health. And again, antioxidants have got a bit of a bad press sometimes because people have tried to make them out as being some kind of extraordinary, wonderful compound that you can put in a pill. There's no evidence that actually putting antioxidants together in a pill, in a supplement, has any effect. It really has to be as part of the whole diet. In fact, there are some very subtle mechanisms that go on in the body which control the level of oxidation that goes on. Sometimes oxidation can be helpful. So we know oxygen is a very reactive molecule, and one of the byproducts of metabolism is reactive oxygen species, what we call free radicals, and these can potentially be damaging. Although the body sometimes uses them actually for good. So it can use them in an oxidative burst, in an inflammatory response to get rid of an infection. It can use these reactive oxygen species, these free radicals, in a controlled way as signaling within cells. And we in our bodies have our own what's called redox systems to decrease the oxidation that's going on that can potentially cause harmful chain reactions. So there's a quite subtle physiology that goes on with antioxidants. But we certainly know that antioxidants have an effect within the body. There's a lot of debate about how many of these antioxidants are absorbed, about how precisely their mechanism of action, whether they affect genes or whether they potentially, even though they're in relatively small amounts in our bodies, whether they work synergistically together to recharge their antioxidant capacity to get rid of these free radicals which are potentially harmful. There's a lot of uncertainty. But what we do know is that antioxidants, anti-inflammatory compounds in extra virgin olive oil can have effects to decrease what we call oxidative stress. That's this damaging scenario where we have plenty of free radicals in our systems, which are potentially damaging our cell walls, potentially damaging our DNA, potentially contributing to heart disease and cancers. So having a diet which is high in antioxidants, in these polyphenols, is really important. Diets can be measured in their inflammatory index. So we can have a diet which has a lot of inflammatory, pro-inflammatory elements to it, which are not countered by anti-inflammatory antioxidants in the diet. And these have what we call a high dietary inflammatory index. And we know that the Mediterranean diet, particularly with extra virgin olive oil, has a very low dietary inflammatory index. So it's a diet which is associated with suppressing chronic inflammation. And we know so many chronic illnesses and diseases are caused by a chronic low-grade state of inflammation, that having a diet which has a low dietary inflammatory index, like the Mediterranean diet, is again consistent with reducing our risk of chronic diseases. And just to illustrate that in real life, there was a fascinating study recently done where a group of people were taken and fed a very low anti-inflammatory, very low antioxidant diet, effectively a highly processed and quite unhealthy diet for a couple of days. Then they were given a single meal of sofrito, and those people who are joining us from Spain or from Italy will be familiar that sofrito, there are various variations, but sofrito is a dish that has got tomatoes, onions, garlic, and extra virgin olive oil, rich in polyphenols, rich in anti-inflammatory compounds. And these people who were studied were fed a single meal of sofrito. And afterwards, inflammatory markers, which are blood tests which can show how much inflammation is going on in the body, were taken. And it was shown that the reduction in these inflammatory markers, this measurable reduction, was substantial following a meal of just of sofrito, which makes it clear how important it is to have an anti-inflammatory diet really every day, to have elements to it which contain anti-inflammatory and antioxidant compounds. Polyphenols are a large proportion of these anti-inflammatory compounds, and there are polyphenols in many plant foods. Polyphenols are created by the plant to protect itself from the ravages of the chemistry of oxygen, which can make fruits rancid, which can break down cells. So plants themselves create these polyphenol antioxidants, which are colored, and so we can see these often in the colors of plants, and there are many of these polyphenols which act to protect the plant from oxygen, from UV light, and from heat, which increases the likelihood of these oxidative reactions which can damage cells in the plant, and also can damage the cells within us as mammals. So plants protect themselves by producing these antioxidants, often in the skins or the bark, and particularly in fruits, to protect fruits from oxidation, from oxidative stress. And indeed, we can see this if you cut open an apple. The apple's core has relatively fewer antioxidant compounds than in the apple's skin, which is highly colored. And we can see that if it's exposed to oxygen and air for a relatively short period of time, it will start to brown. Reactions will go on with the oxygen. And it's the polyphenols in the apple's outer skin which protects it from those effects of the reactions. And olive oil in particular has very high levels of polyphenols. The olive tree has to adapt to an environment which is highly stressful, which is highly reactive, with lots of UV light, lots of heat and oxygen around, which can degrade the olive and cause it to be rancid. So the more stressed an olive tree is, the more it's likely to produce polyphenols to protect itself. And those polyphenols can then go on and benefit us. So production of olive oil is really important in terms of preserving those polyphenols, and the enemies in production of extra virgin olive oil are UV light and heat and oxygen itself. And so if we go to a mill where the olive is pressed, it needs to be pressed really quickly with as little contact with heat and UV light and oxygen as possible to produce a product which is high in these polyphenols. The polyphenols in oil helps to protect the oil from cooking, so a good extra virgin olive oil under the heat of cooking will survive and will be preserved based on its levels of polyphenols and its antioxidants. So that's really important to remember as well, because not only is it perfectly safe to cook with extra virgin olive oil, but it's actually beneficial to cook with extra virgin olive oil because it's rich in these polyphenols. And the polyphenols can mix with other polyphenols in fruit, in vegetables, and in other compounds, and enrich that. So cooking with extra virgin olive oil is actually a desirable thing to do. And the Mediterranean diet is clearly based around cooking in extra virgin olive oil. No other fat is used. So I just want to finish off to say that having explored extra virgin olive oil and the Mediterranean diet in terms of the importance for health, in terms of the importance for in particular these times which are so challenging and difficult, and in terms of trying to reset how healthily we live in terms of our diet and lifestyle, I think it's just important to also acknowledge those people who work so hard to produce good quality extra virgin olive oil, which is full of these polyphenols, full of anti-inflammatory and antioxidant compounds, which can be so protective and can be so part and central to this Mediterranean diet. And I know people work really, really hard to produce really high quality extra virgin olive oil, which is rich in these compounds and which you can actually taste. And again, part of the education, part of communication to the general public is about helping people to understand that you can taste these rich compounds in extra virgin olive oil. They'll give you some bitterness and some pepperiness, some pungency, which adds to taste, adds to flavor. And I think education is absolutely key to make sure that people understand about the health benefits of the Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil, but understand also how to access it and how to make it work for them, and how to recognize it in the taste and the quality of the food that they can really enjoy. And so I think looking forwards into the future, I think if we could communicate those messages, I think if we can help people to understand about those elements of quality, if we can help people to understand that actually it's worthwhile investing and valuing this product, which is so hard to produce. It's not like an industrial seed oil that you can mass produce. Extra virgin olive oil is difficult to produce. It takes many man hours. It takes a lot of nurturing, a lot of care, and it's a product which absolutely has to be valued, and people need to understand that if they are prepared to spend €7, €10 on a bottle of wine that lasts a night or two, actually it's about resetting our definitions of how much we value food and how much we value in particular extra virgin olive oil and those producers who work so hard to produce excellent quality extra virgin olive oil, which we know can so helpfully promote and help health. So I will stop there and hand over to back to Leila, who I think will chair, but very happy to answer any questions as we move forwards.